Every Thursday morning, before the world fully woke, a woman walked through the iron gates of Mercy Hill Cemetery with the same quiet ritual: a handful of wildflowers, a worn envelope, and the kind of silence that only grief can teach. For 3 years, she had come to the same plot beneath the old oak tree, knelt in the damp grass, and spoke words no one else would ever hear. Her brother had been gone longer than she had known him alive. He died at 19, caught between a moment of boyish recklessness and the mercy of fate. The world had moved on. His friends had married, had children, built lives that no longer included his name, but she could not forget. She would not. Then, one autumn, a man began appearing at the cemetery during her visits, not to her brother's grave, but to the one beside it. He was older, weathered by something that looked like the same kind of loss she carried. Week after week, they orbited each other in silent proximity, two strangers bound by grief, never speaking, yet somehow understanding everything that words could never say. What neither of them realized was that their separate sorrows were about to become a story of profound connection, one where seeing another person's true face, in all its brokenness and beauty, would finally teach them how to live again. Chapter 1. The Ritual. The morning air held that particular coldness that comes just before autumn surrenders to winter. Sarah's breath emerged in small clouds as she knelt beside her brother's headstone. The granite was cool against her palms, the letters still sharp after all these years. Michael James Patterson, 1985-2004. Beloved son and brother. Beloved. The word had always felt incomplete. Beloved but gone. Beloved but never old enough to fall in love himself. Beloved but forgotten by nearly everyone except her. She arranged the wildflowers, purple asters and yellow goldenrod, in the small vase anchored into the earth. They would last until next Thursday. Everything in the cemetery had rhythms. The flowers died. She returned. The seasons turned. She was here, and he remained still. "I brought the blue ones this time," she whispered, though she was not entirely sure if she was speaking to Michael or to the vast, indifferent silence that always answered her here. "Remember how you said they looked like little pieces of sky? Mom never understood why you cared about flowers. I understood." She pressed the envelope into the ground beside the vase. Inside was a letter she would never send, words meant for a brother who would never read them. She had been writing to him for 3 years, small confessions, fragments of her week, moments where she saw something he would have found funny and wished she could have shared it with him. The cemetery was nearly empty at this hour. A groundskeeper worked somewhere distant, the sound of his mower carrying across the rows of the dead. Beyond the fence, the town was waking, cars passing, early commuters heading toward lives full of deadlines and ordinary concerns. The cemetery existed in a different dimension, one where time moved according to loss rather than clocks. That was when she noticed him. He stood 3 plots away at the grave marked Catherine Marie Ashford, 1960-2019. He was tall, with silver threading through his dark hair, and he held a single white rose. He had not been there last week. Sarah would have remembered. She remembered everyone here, even the faces she saw only once before they stopped coming. He did not look at her. He simply stood, the rose hanging at his side, and looked at the stone with the kind of expression that suggested he was reading words written long before this moment. His face was lined in a way that suggested the lines had been earned slowly, through years of small heartbreaks, rather than one catastrophic moment. Sarah looked away. In the cemetery, you did not intrude on another person's grief. You simply acknowledged it by respecting its boundaries. She stayed a few minutes longer, her fingers tracing the letters of her brother's name as she had done 1,000 times before. The stone was familiar as her own skin. She knew which letters the weather had begun to smooth, where lichen grew in the curves of the M, how the sunlight caught different parts of the inscription at different times of year. "I'll be back next week," she told Michael, as she always did. "I promise." When she stood and turned to leave, she glanced once more at the stranger. He was kneeling now, his hand pressed against the headstone below Catherine's name. His shoulders were still, but something in the line of his back suggested that stillness was the only thing holding him together. Sarah understood that feeling. She had worn it like a coat for 3 years. She walked toward the gate, her footsteps soft on the grass, and she did not look back. Chapter 2. The Pattern. The next Thursday, he was there again. Sarah noticed immediately, though she told herself she was simply being observant, the way anyone is in a place they know intimately. The stranger stood in almost exactly the same spot, in almost exactly the same posture, with almost exactly the same stillness. This time, he did look at her. It was only for a moment, a glance, really, barely long enough to be acknowledged, but it carried weight. His eyes were grey, and in them Sarah saw the architecture of old sorrow, the kind that had been lived with so long it had become part of his bone structure. She nodded slightly. He nodded back. Then they both returned to their separate griefs. Sarah knelt and removed last week's flowers. They had faded to papery ghosts of themselves, the purple of the asters gone dusty and dim. She placed them gently in a small pile beside the grave. Not trash, she never thought of them as trash, but rather a small acknowledgement that they had served their purpose. They had been beautiful once, they had marked time. That was enough. "There's someone else here now," she told Michael, arranging fresh flowers in the vase. "A man. He's been coming for at least 2 weeks. He looks like someone who knows what it means to miss someone very badly." The stranger placed his rose on Catherine's headstone, not in a vase, but laying across the granite itself, a gesture that seemed both intimate and final, as though the rose was a message that only Catherine would understand. He remained longer than Sarah had expected, his hand touching the stone in what might have been a caress or might have been an accusation. She could not tell. Grief wore many faces. When he finally stood to leave, he paused near the path that would take him past Sarah. For a moment, it seemed as though he might speak. His mouth opened slightly, his eyes found hers again with that same weight of recognition, and Sarah held her breath without knowing why. But then a look crossed his face, something like doubt, or perhaps fear, and he simply walked on. Sarah stayed longer that day, long enough to watch his car pull away from the small parking area beyond the gates, long enough to hear the silence settle back over the cemetery like water closing over a stone. She did not know then that she was witnessing the beginning of something neither of them would choose, but both of them would need. Comment where you're watching from. These stories of kindness connect hearts across the world. Chapter 3. The Recognition. For 6 weeks they became part of each other's Thursday mornings. They never spoke. They never acknowledged each other directly beyond those small nods, those careful glances that carried the weight of understanding. But something was shifting in the space between them, a slow gravitational pull that neither of them resisted. Sarah began to notice details. The rose he brought was always white, always pristine, and always placed with the kind of reverence that suggested habit had not diminished ritual. On colder mornings, she saw how he wore the same grey coat, how his hands trembled slightly as he arranged the flower. Once, she saw him wipe his eyes before turning to leave. She wondered who Catherine had been, daughter perhaps, or a wife, or someone else entirely. The cemetery held many kinds of love. The man began to notice details about Sarah, too. The way she always brought wildflowers, never formal arrangements. The way she knelt without using the bench, despite how it must have hurt her knees on the cold earth. The way she sometimes whispered, her lips moving in words no one else could hear, the way she always lingered, the last visitor in the cemetery except for him. On the 7th week, it rained. It was the kind of rain that should have kept people away, the kind that made the cemetery feel like a place of pure sorrow, the sky so low it seemed to rest directly on the gravestones. Sarah came anyway. She always came. The rain did not matter. She was arranging flowers, her hair soaked through, rain dripping from her chin onto Michael's stone when the man approached. Not close enough to be intrusive, but close enough that it was deliberate. Not close enough to speak, but close enough that the intention was clear. "He was your brother," the man said. His voice was quiet, rough from disuse, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who had not spoken to another living person in a long time. Sarah looked up, water running down her face. For a moment, she could not speak. No one came to the cemetery to talk. The cemetery was a place of silence. "Yes," she finally said. "How did you read his stone the same way I read hers," he said. "Like you're still waiting for it to say something different." Sarah's throat tightened. She did not know this man. He was a stranger in every way, except the one that mattered most. "I'm James," he said. "Catherine was my daughter." The words hung in the rain between them like an offering. Sarah told him her name, and in doing so, she did something she had not done in years. She spoke her brother's name to another living person, and it did not break her. Chapter 4. The Confession. After that first conversation, there was no going back. They began to arrive at the cemetery slightly earlier, lingering slightly longer. They began to sit on the old bench beneath the oak tree, not speaking at first, but sitting in companionable silence while the rain came, or the sun emerged, or the seasons turned their slow, indifferent wheel. James told Sarah about Catherine when they were ready for him to tell. She had been 31 when the stroke came. Young, healthy, unremarkable in every way, except in how thoroughly her absence had rewritten his life. His wife had died when Catherine was young, and after that, the two of them had orbited each other in a quiet devotion. They had been not just parent and child, but companions, the two remaining pieces of a family that had been broken early. When Catherine died, James had stopped speaking to almost everyone. He had stopped going to work. He had moved into a small apartment near the cemetery and had fallen into the habit of visiting her grave every single day until recently, when he had reduced it to Thursdays, the day Catherine had been born. "I was losing myself," he told Sarah one morning, his voice hollow, "coming every day, talking to her stone, as if she could hear me, as if my words mattered anymore. I thought that by coming less often, I was accepting that she was gone, but really, I was just admitting that I didn't know how to be alive in a world without her." Sarah listened. She understood this feeling the way she understood her own heartbeat. "My brother was 19, she told him. "He died in an accident, a car he had no business driving. A curve he took too fast, a moment where being alive and being dead was separated by something smaller than a decision. I was 23. I was supposed to protect him somehow. I was supposed to be better at living so that he could learn from me. Instead, I learned from his absence." She paused, gathering the words carefully. "For 3 years, I have come here every Thursday. And I have talked to him as if he might listen, as if maybe there is some version of the universe where my voice reaches across the distance between here and wherever he is. I know it's not true. I know I'm probably just talking to myself. But talking to him is the only way I have found to keep myself alive, because when I stopped talking to him, I found I was barely breathing." James reached out and took her hand. It was the first time they had touched, and the contact sent a small shock through both of them. Not romantic, not yet, but the shock of being truly seen by another person who understood the specific weight of what you carried. Maybe, he said slowly, we are supposed to find people who are still talking to the dead. Because those are the people who understand that love doesn't end when someone dies. It just changes shape. Chapter 5. The Unraveling. For 3 weeks after that first hand-holding, James and Sarah existed in a strange, tentative space. They arrived together. They sat together. They spoke about Michael and Catherine, about the lives that had been lived, about the specific loneliness of surviving when the person you loved most did not. But they did not acknowledge what was beginning to happen between them, something more than friendship, something that neither of them had thought they were capable of feeling ever again. Then one Thursday, James did not arrive. Sarah waited past her usual time. She waited until the groundskeeper began his end-of-day preparations. She waited until the sky began to darken, the autumn afternoon surrendering early to dusk. James did not come. The next Thursday, he was not there either. Sarah found herself arriving earlier the following week, staying later, checking the cemetery parking area as if James might materialize if she looked hard enough. She began to worry, a feeling she had not allowed herself to experience in so long it felt almost foreign. This involuntary concern for another person's well-being, this sudden knowledge that someone else's absence could matter to her survival. On the fourth Thursday, a woman appeared near Catherine's grave. She was middle-aged, sharp-featured, with the particular exhaustion that comes from managing crisis. "Are you Sarah?" the woman asked without preamble. Sarah's heart seized. Something in her knew, before the words came, that she was about to receive information that would change the shape of her life. "I'm Margaret, James's sister," the woman continued. "He's in the hospital. He had a fall. A stroke, actually. Or maybe it was just a fall that triggered something. The doctors aren't entirely clear. He kept asking them to contact me, to tell me to come to this cemetery, to look for a woman named Sarah. He said if I found you, I should tell you that he's sorry." The world seemed to stop moving. "Which hospital?" Sarah asked, already standing, already aware that the rhythms of Thursday morning were about to be broken forever. "St. Michael's," Margaret said. "But Sarah, I need to tell you something. James hasn't let anyone get close to him in a long time. Not since Catherine died. Whatever you are to him, you've helped him. I haven't seen him speak in complete sentences in 2 years. I haven't seen him eat a real meal or leave his apartment or seem like he had any reason to keep existing. Until recently. Until you." Chapter 6. The Reckoning. The hospital room was small and dim, lit only by the pale winter light coming through a single window and the glow of monitors tracking James's heartbeat, his blood pressure, the electrical activity of a brain that had faltered but not failed. He had indeed suffered a stroke, the doctors explained, a minor one, caught early. There would be recovery, there would be rehabilitation, there would be months of careful effort to rebuild what had been suddenly arbitrarily broken. But when Sarah saw James, what struck her most was not the slight slackness at one corner of his mouth or the way his left hand lay inert on the hospital blanket. What struck her was his eyes, which still held that particular clarity of grief and love and the desperate knowledge of how quickly a person can be taken from you. "I'm sorry," he said. His words were slightly slurred, but his meaning was unmistakable. "I was going to tell you. I was going to explain, but then something stopped working in my head, and suddenly I was here, and I didn't know if I would ever see you again." Sarah took the hand that could still feel, and she held it. "Tell me what?" she asked, though she thought she already knew. The fear that had been living in her chest since Margaret appeared suddenly crystallized into words. "Tell me that you were sick, that you were hiding something, that this was all some kind of misguided mercy." "Tell you that I was dying," James said, "or that I thought I was. The doctors have been telling me for a year that my heart isn't what it used to be, that I need to prepare for Catherine to have company." He closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, Sarah saw tears sliding down his temples. "I was going to die in that apartment, visiting Catherine every day, until eventually someone found me and added my name to a stone near hers. And then you came, and suddenly I didn't want that anymore. Suddenly I wanted to live, and I was terrified because wanting to live when you've been dead inside for so long feels like a betrayal." "It's not," Sarah said fiercely. "James, it's not a betrayal. It's love recognizing that love can still exist even after everything has been taken from us." If this story has already touched your heart, hit the like button. It helps the message of compassion reach more people who need hope. Chapter 7. The Memory. During his recovery, James told Sarah about Catherine, not the sanitized version he had told in fragments before, but the full story, the complicated, painful, beautiful truth. Catherine had been born when his wife was 40, a surprise that had seemed like impossible grace. She was a quiet child, artistic, always drawing, always seeing the world in ways that other people missed. She had wanted to be a photographer, to capture what she called the light hidden in ordinary moments. After her mother died, Catherine had turned to James with a devotion that sometimes frightened him with its intensity. She had never married, never truly left home, and he had let her stay, because the alternative, a house emptied of her presence, was unthinkable. The stroke had come on a Tuesday, sudden and final. She had been at work, at her desk, photographing products for a website, when her brain had simply stopped cooperating with her heart. She was dead before the ambulance arrived. "I used to be angry at her," James confessed, "for leaving me, for choosing death as if it were a choice, for taking the only meaning I had in the world with her." "And now?" Sarah asked. "Now I understand that she didn't choose anything. She was simply taken, just like your brother was taken. And the only thing we can do with that knowledge is love more fiercely, live more deliberately, because we know what it costs when time is stolen from us." He reached for Sarah's hand again, his grip stronger now, as his body slowly remembered how to be whole. "When I was lying on the floor of my apartment after the stroke, waiting for help to arrive, all I could think was that I had wasted time. I had been given a second chance. Somehow, after years of slowly dying, someone came along and gave me a reason to keep breathing, and I was going to lose it through carelessness, through the simple, ordinary carelessness of a body that was never going to be young again." "You didn't lose it," Sarah said. "I might have," he said, "but I didn't, because you came to find me, and that matters." Chapter 8. The Return. It took 3 months for James to recover enough to leave the hospital. His speech returned slowly, his strength more slowly still. But something else returned too, a quality of presence, a way of inhabiting his own life that suggested he had decided, on some fundamental level, that living mattered. Sarah visited him during his rehabilitation, during his first tentative weeks back at the small apartment, during the long afternoons when they sat together and simply existed in each other's presence. On the first Thursday after James was discharged, they returned to the cemetery together. It was early spring, the kind of morning when the world feels like it is about to remember how to bloom. The grass was still brown, but there was a sense of green waiting just beneath the surface, of life preparing to reassert itself through the mechanisms of season and time and biological imperative. They stood together at Catherine's grave, and at Michael's, their shoulders almost touching, their breathing synchronized. "I used to come here because I didn't know how to stop," James said quietly. "Catherine had taken so much of my capacity to live that I didn't know how to be a person without her. I thought if I stayed close enough to her stone, if I visited often enough, that somehow the visiting itself would be living. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a photograph. It showed a young woman, clear-eyed and smiling, holding a camera. This was Catherine's favorite photograph of herself, he said. She took it in a mirror, and she's captured herself at the exact moment of joy. She looks like she knew something we don't. He placed the photograph under a small stone on Catherine's grave, a physical reminder that they had been here together, remembering her as more than loss. I want to stop coming here, James said then, not because I don't love Catherine, but because I'm starting to understand that loving her doesn't require me to be dead too, and I think, he paused, gathering courage, I think Michael would want the same for you. Sarah felt something shift in her chest, some burden she had carried for 3 years beginning to lighten. What are you saying? She asked, though she knew. I'm saying that maybe we could visit less. Maybe we could spend our Thursdays somewhere else, somewhere alive. Maybe we could try to build something that isn't organized around our grief, but around something else. Around, he struggled for the word, around hope, maybe. Around the possibility that 2 people who have lost everything could still find something worth keeping. Sarah knelt and placed her own envelope in the grass beside Michael's stone. She did not need to read it. She knew what it said. All the letters she had written to him for 3 years, all the conversations she had had with his absence, all the ways she had been trying to make absence into presence. Okay, she told James, let's go find some hope. Chapter 9. The New Ritual. A year later, on an early spring Thursday, James and Sarah returned to Mercy Hill Cemetery for the first time in months. They did not come often now. The weekly visits had given way to monthly ones, then to visits that came when they felt the need rather than from obligation. James had returned to some form of work, consulting, he called it, which seemed to mean he spent afternoons on his laptop helping small business owners solve problems. Sarah had started volunteering at a community center, teaching art classes to children, becoming the keeper of small, creative moments for kids who had never thought of themselves as artists. They had built a life together, not in spite of their grief, but alongside it, allowing it to inform and deepen everything they did. Today, they carried 2 new photographs to place at the graves, one of Catherine, as she had been, and one of Michael. A copy Sarah had recently discovered in an old box, her brother captured at 17, laughing at something just outside the frame, alive and whole and impossibly young. But they also carried something else, a small photograph they had taken of themselves here in the cemetery 3 days ago. In it, they were standing between the 2 graves, James's arm around Sarah's shoulders, both of them smiling with the complicated smile of people who had learned to hold joy and sorrow in the same hand. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked as they arranged the photographs. "Coming here that day? Getting pulled into my grief?" James considered the question seriously. "No," he said finally, "because that wasn't what happened. You didn't pull me into your grief. You pulled me out of mine. You showed me that grief doesn't have to be the final word, that it can be the beginning of something else." He placed the joint photograph on a small stone between the 2 graves. "Catherine would have liked you," he said. "She always said that the best photographs are the ones that show people at the moment when they realize they're allowed to be happy. That moment, right before the smile fully forms, when hope is just beginning to win." Sarah squeezed his hand. They stayed only a few minutes longer, the time of their visits grown shorter as they needed to return to the living world more urgently. As they walked toward the gates, Sarah took one last look back at the graves, and she understood something she had not understood before. The cemetery would always be part of them. Michael and Catherine would always be part of them, but they were not the whole story anymore. The whole story had expanded to include this: 2 people meeting in grief, learning that the only way forward was to walk it together. They left the cemetery as the afternoon light turned golden, the spring air warm on their faces, the promise of bloom in the trees. And behind them, on two graves in a quiet corner of the earth, two photographs stood watch. One of a girl who loved to find light in ordinary moments, one of a boy who had been taken too soon, and one of two people who had learned that kindness to each other was the highest form of remembrance. Epilogue. In the end, the cemetery was not where their story ended. It was where they learned that stories don't have to end where sorrow began. They can find new chapters in the light of someone else's understanding, in the quiet grace of being truly, finally seen. Subscribe for more stories of love, courage, and redemption. Thank you for watching the story of the stranger who visited her dead brother's grave weekly until he finally saw her true face. Let's keep spreading the light.